Hello YouTube, welcome back to the channel, and this is my 2002 E39 M5. I've recently done a full suspension refresh on it, and that included the install of a brand new set of ground control coilovers. So that is what I have for you in this video, step-by-step install of the coilover set. And it is not too difficult of a job, but it does take time, and it is suspension work, which is never fun. But I did this over the span of 3 days. First day I took all of the rear interior apart, which you'll need in order to access the top of the struts. Then I finished up the rear, and then I worked on the fronts. Let me show you real quick what the interior looks like when you get ready to do this job. So everything you don't see here needs to come off in order for you to get to the top of the struts. And now I am not going to include the step-by-step on how to remove all of this on this video. I am including only a time-lapse just for you to get a sense of the work involved. But if you do want to see a step-by-step of this, check out this other video on my channel. Now there's some important things that I wanted to highlight with regards to this step specifically. Removal of the interior and all that. Number one, you are definitely not going to want to put this back together after you're done with the install. You're going to want to have enough seat time to make sure the install went correctly, that there are no weird noises or anything like that, and that you've had enough time to adjust your dampers, which require access to the top of the struts. Only once you are 100% satisfied and you know you're not going to have to touch this, then you put everything back together. The last thing you want to do is do this more than once. On that note, if you are considering taking this to a shop to get coilovers installed on a car like this, I would highly recommend you take care of these. Otherwise, it's going to be expensive added labor to the overall job. And it'll give you some time to do it yourself once you get the car back and get everything dialed in, etc. All right, so with that, let's get going. Let me tell you, it is really hard to believe that BMW designed this in such a way that you have to go through all this just to get to the top of the struts. You know, I had read about it, I knew what I was getting into, but you know, even as you're going through it, it's mind-blowing. So now we need to get this strut out of here, and that's going to be probably the worst part of this job. And if you can see here, it is the bottom of the shock here is boxed in between the trailing arms and the control arms, so there's no way you can move it to the sides if you wanted to get the right angle to, you know, remove it completely. It is also stuck at the top here by this liner and some other hardware that is under the liner that you'll see in a minute. I have already gone through this assessment on the other side, and taking the liner out and removing whatever's in the way was actually quite easy. So I went that route. And if you don't want to deal with control arms and ball joints or anything like that, then I would recommend you do the same. So let's start by removing this liner. So once you have all the clips and the nuts and the bolts out of the way, you can start pulling this liner out. Just be careful. This is gonna be brittle, of course, and it can break easily, so take your time. Oh. You see how easy this cracks? Now, something very important about this rear suspension is that the whole thing is designed in such a way that the shocks are always putting pressure downwards and keeping this whole assembly in place. The moment I release or remove this shock, this whole thing is going to want to come up a little bit, a few inches. And that could make it really hard for you to put the new strut back in. In my case, I'm putting a coilover, which, you know, it's easier to adjust. So maybe not that big of a deal, but if you're doing OEM struts or something like this Bilsteins, that could be a major problem, because you're gonna have to somehow push this back down while you align the bolts and everything else, and it'll just make things complicated. So the trick here is gonna be to put something in between this arm right here and the frame of the car, so that it holds this whole thing in place when you remove the shock. For that, one common approach is to use a piece of wood that you can cut so that it fits here, and you can snug it in there basically against the frame, and that'll, you know, keep the suspension from jumping up. The right size for this would be between 9 1/4 to 9 1/2 inches will do the trick. I actually have two, depending on where I want to place them, but that works fine. Now, there is very little space here to reach the shock bolt, and you can't really fit an impact gun or anything like that. Even putting in a breaker bar can be a challenge with all of this in the way. So what I found worked best was to detach the sway bar, just the top of the sway bar link, so that you can remove this link out of the way, and then I can fit, you know, a breaker bar or a ratchet with no issues. And now I have a little bit more room just to reach that shock bolt there. And that's a 21mm bolt. And just for good measure, I'm gonna put another piece of wood here and take this out completely. And now we're ready to get back inside the car, and we have 3 13mm bolts that we have to remove. So now comes the fun part, and here's why we removed the liner. Initially was so that we could get access to pretty much everything here that's in the way. This is an expansion tank, and we just have to carefully remove these lines here, or, you know, snap them off. I believe there's a bolt right there, and just kind of push this out of the way so we can get the strut out, and then we'll put it back. I'm gonna leave it like that for now. I think that's enough for me to wiggle this out of there. Passenger side is similar, except you're dealing with the fuel hose here, and you just have to take a nut out of here, one all the way at the top, and then this thing just falls down like this. You can hang it in here and just leave it like that while you work the strut out. That's the only thing that's in the way. Let's see if we can get this thing out. That's the bottom right there, and our blocks of wood are doing their job. Everything's staying still here. Yeah, it's definitely in the way still. Let's see if I can move the expansion tank a little bit further down. I think that's gonna be enough. And it's out. And here we have a side-by-side of the ground control setup and the Bilstein B8 with the in-track springs. Now let's get this thing back up there. So let's get this coilover in here. We'll just leave this resting here. The bottom part snaps into where the chuck bolt goes, and I'm gonna check top, make sure that I have all the holes aligned. So I can come up here again and start putting these nuts on the top of the strut, just to hold it in place for now. We don't have to tighten anything. I may have to push it a little bit more. Let's see. We can now put the bottom, the chuck bolt back on, and I actually got new hardware for these, even though the ones that were in there look good, but these are suspension parts, and you know, they take a beating over time and stress, so it's never a bad idea to put fresh new hardware when you're replacing parts. There's a washer provided by ground control. And we're not gonna torque this down or anything at this time. We're just gonna hand tight so that it stays in place and we can remove the piece of wood, etc. I'm actually going to raise the coil a little bit, similar to where I have it on the other side, and that should be good. There we go. We're now at the point that we can put this thing back in here. And let me tell you, this may look like a lot of work, but it really isn't. It's really easy to put this thing back together, and it makes it even easier to remove the strut. I initially thought I was gonna remove the control arm and wiggle it out that way from the bottom. And when I looked at the ball joints and how rusty those bolts were, and how uncomfortable it is to even fit a wrench back there, and the fact that then you have to torque everything down, especially if you remove the bushings from the frame, you have to torque everything down with the suspension loaded. When you add all that up, trust me, this is a lot easier than doing that. Now we can torque these top nuts down, and these are 21 foot-pounds. And with everything installed, it is now time to finish up the bottom bolt here for the shock, and we have to torque this down to 94 foot-pounds, but you don't want to do this with the car in the air. You have to finish the torque with suspension under load. So for that, I'm gonna put the wheels back on, bring the car back down to the ground, and then I'm gonna finish up the torque. You'll notice I will leave the sway bar disconnected so that I can get enough room to put in my torque wrench and get the range of motion that I need. I just dropped the car on top of these pieces of wood here. I have two 2x6s on top of each other, so that's roughly about 3 inches more clearance, and that was enough space for me to get under and get my torque wrench onto that bottom bolt. And what you'll find here is that the range of motion for your torque wrench is going to be limited by the suspension components, the control arm on the top here mainly. So it doesn't matter if you get this car way up high in the air in a 4-post lift, you still have the same range of motion to get your torque wrench in there. So just raise the car just enough so that you can fit under and torque that thing down. So we're done with the bottom bolt. Have the car back up in the air, and I'm ready to torque down the sway bar links, and that's going to be 48 foot-pounds. And with that, we now have everything here torqued down to spec. So I gotta do the other side, and I'm pretty much done with the rears. Alright, so before we start wrenching, let's talk about the process and what we're trying to do here, which is basically to get this strut out of there. So you have this knuckle here holding the hub and the rotor, and that's attached to the car by two control arms, your sway bar link, and your tie rods to the steering rack, and to the top of the car via the actual strut itself, which is obviously mounted to the chock towers. So in order to get this strut out of the way, what we're trying to do is basically move this in such a way, or get enough flexibility out of this knuckle so that we get the right angle that we need to basically pull the strut out of the wheel well. And that's really all we're trying to do here. So depending on who you ask, or which forum you're reading, or whatever other YouTube video you may be watching, you'll see a variety of different approaches to this. Now, I am all for whatever is the easiest, but also has the least amount of risk. Now, you will need to detach something out of this knuckle in order to get enough play and do this. And some may recommend removing the tie rods. I don't like that idea. You have to do it with a ball joint. You can mess up the alignment more than is necessary, so scratch that, at least in my opinion. The other options are the control arms. Now, you have two choices. You can detach from the knuckle, or you can detach from the frame, and that's a lot easier. Just keep in mind that when you have to put everything back together, you're gonna have to torque those down to spec while under load, and that could make things a little bit complicated depending on your setup, you know, what you have to work with, etc. And a couple of tips, and something that mostly everybody's gonna need to do in a job like this. The sway bar link, you're gonna wanna disconnect that. Also, on the passenger side, there is a sensor for your lights, the auto leveling feature, that you're gonna wanna disconnect before you move this too much so that you don't break it. And the caliper, of course, these are flexible brake lines here that are attached to the top, and this whole thing is going to come down, of course, for you to be able to pull this out, and you don't want to stress those lines or break them, or you're going to be in a serious situation. So you can just take this whole caliper assembly out of here. There's two bolts in the back, and then hang it or leave it resting on something safely so that you don't stress these lines. And again, given that this whole thing is going to have to come down, especially once you take the top nuts off of the strut, you probably want something to hold that in place. This is heavy, and you don't want to have your arms tied up here. You'll be in a bad spot. So use a floor jack if you have one. Just put a piece of wood on it and give it some support from below. You'll be able to move this around as needed as well. This will also help you when you're mounting everything back together, as you'll see in a moment. Now, I'm going to start with the sway bar link. So next we're going to remove the pinch bolt here, and that is what keeps the knuckle closed and tight around the strut. 16mm bolt and 18mm nut on the other side. I'm just gonna again limit the risk and take this off. It's only 2 bolts. It is time to take these nuts off, and in order to get to this one here, you'll see that this is in the way, so I can't fit my wrench or my torque wrench to put it back. So I'm gonna have to take this thing off. Good thing this is pretty easy to come off. Just this rubber seal. Get this out. There's a clip right there. Gotta unsnap the clips that go to the air duct here. There's 3 of them, and this whole assembly just comes out like that. And we're now ready to take these top nuts off, and those are 13mm. I'm going to be loosening this control arm here, lower, or wishbone I believe is the name. Now, as you just saw, I was able to pull the strut out fairly easily, but sometimes even after you release the pinch bolt, the knuckle is going to be holding that very tight, especially if you're replacing an OEM strut with, you know, high mileage. And there is a special tool right here. It's called the strut spreader, and it allows you to open up that space just a little bit more so that you can easily put it in and out. You may need it to also to install the new one. I haven't really need to use this yet, but I still have it as a backup, so I would recommend you buy this. This is like 12 bucks before you start this job, just in case you run into a snag and you do need it. I'm gonna clean the area a little bit before I put the new one in. And here's the new ground control coilover. Sweet setup, really. I really like how this is designed. You have camber plates up top, also adjustable for caster. You have Connie adjustable struts on the top here for damper, and they have these really cool notch here in the housing. I don't know if the camera can see it. But that just gives you a little bit more clearance for wider wheels and tires. So we're ready to get this thing on here, and it's gonna be the same process in reverse. I'm gonna lower this down with the help of my jack, and I'm gonna wiggle it in there, slide it into the knuckle, and get it all tight on top of the strut tower. Now this is gonna be a little bit easier than this because I can compress this just to get it in there as needed. It is also shorter anyways. Continue to use the floor jack to help me get it up there slowly. And you can grab them with the top nuts just to keep it in place. No need to tighten this yet. Now I'm gonna want to make sure that the strut is sitting completely on the knuckle, and it goes down as far as it can, and for that I'm going to use the floor jack and then try and push this up. I think that's pretty much as far as it goes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these do offer caster adjustment as well, so I'm trying to keep it right in the middle for now until I take it to an alignment shop, and I am looking at both sides. And the cool thing is that they have this ground control lettering here, which serves as a reference point to see how far you are, or basically to do an eyeball caster adjustment. So I'm just gonna level it and put it right where the other one is, which is right where you can see ground control completely through the strut tower hole here. Camber is set already on both sides, pretty much again eyeballing it the same way, a little bit above -1 camber. I'm not gonna torque this down yet. I'm just making sure it sits flat and not moving anymore. Well, the coil is installed, and now I just gotta put back the pinch bolt, make sure it's tight in there, and the rest is going to be the same process in reverse. We're going to put the caliper back on the rotor, put back the sway bar, and finish up here. So we have everything down here back where it belongs. Everything's tight and torqued to spec, with the exception of the control arm over here. And that one I'm just gonna hand tight for now. You do want to torque this while under load, while the suspension is sitting pretty much at normal ride height, which is not where it's tense right now, so I'm just gonna hand tie this for now and we'll get back to that one. Now you'll notice that I have the spring perch all the way at the top of the collar here, which means the coil is set up at the highest right height, and this is how you want to start, so that when you do put the wheels back on and lower the car and everything, you know, sort of settles, you don't risk any issues, and you know, everything clears and nothing went wrong with the coil as it compressed, and then you can, you know, get the car back up and start adjusting the right height as needed. So that's gonna do it for the installation. I did finish off the control arm off camera. I got everything torqued down to spec with the car on the ground, under load, and I had a chance to get everything checked out for a second time when the car was up in the alignment rack. Now watch out for some more videos coming up. I'll do a whole review on what the suspension setup feels like, you know, after I've had enough seat time and get everything dialed to my liking. Thanks for watching, and I will see you all on the next one. Peace.